and welcome to our first video in our series on the English language. On screen now are instructions for how to add captions because I will be speaking in English the entire time, so you might need them. There are 16 tenses in the English language, and each week we'll be going over a different tense, beginning with week 1, the simple present. When do we use this tense? We use it when we are 1. Talking about things that are happening in the moment. For example, he scores a goal. Or 2. Talking about things that happen regularly. For example, he rides his bike to work every day. You can split this tense into 3 basic groups: affirmative statements, negative statements, and questions. And we'll get started by focusing on affirmative statements. So there are 2 general categories you'll be splitting subjects into when you're conjugating for the simple present tense. There's I, you, they, and we, and there's he, she, and it. There are some exceptions to this, but we'll talk about those at the end. So if you want to conjugate for I, you, they, or we, all you have to do is start with your subject and then add a verb in its most basic form. So you don't need to do anything to it. Depending on your verb, you can end the sentence there, or you might need to add more information. So let's look at some examples. We'll take the verb run. I run, you run, they run, we run. With more detail, I run every day, you run track, they run 2 miles. Now I'll give you a chance to practice using the verb laugh. I, you, Stacy and Amanda, Charlie and I. Alright, I hope you got those right. Before we move on, I want to mention that not all verbs can be put at the end of a sentence. For example, I want is not a complete sentence. I want cake, however, is a complete sentence. And there isn't really a way to tell which verbs can end the sentence and which verbs can't. You kind of just have to memorize them the more you listen to people speak and the more you practice speaking. But now let's move on to how to conjugate he, she, and it. This is a little more complicated but still pretty easy. You start with your subject and then you add your verb with the letter S at the end. And you can end the sentence there, or you might need to add more details. So let's look at some examples. Let's take the verb eat. He eats, she eats, it eats. He eats bread, she eats rice, it eats oats. And really quickly, I want to mention that it is a verb that can be used to refer to animals, but a lot of people will instead use she or he to refer to animals. So it's just up to your personal preference. Okay, now I'll let you practice using the verb fall. Michael, Elena, the picture. Okay, I hope you did well, because now we're going to make things a little more difficult and we're going to talk about exceptions. So sometimes you have to do more than just adding an S to the end of the verb. For example, let's say you have a verb that ends in a consonant and then a Y. When that happens, you drop the Y at the end and replace it with an IES. So copy ends in a PY, so it becomes copies. Tidy ends in a DY, so it becomes tidies. Cry ends in an RY, so it becomes cries. And remember, this is only if it's a consonant and then a Y. If the verb ends in a vowel and a Y, all you have to do is add an S at the end like normal. So stay becomes stays, enjoy becomes enjoys, and convey becomes conveys, because they end in a vowel and then a Y. So the next exception we'll talk about is the word have. You don't just add an S to the end of this, so it doesn't become haves. Instead, you drop the VE at the end and you replace it with an S. So have becomes has. Okay, so the next set of examples is when a verb ends in the sound that an S makes, or a sound that's similar to the sound that an S makes. So x, ch, and sh. It would be kind of difficult to just add an S to the end of those verbs. It would be hard to pronounce. So instead of doing that, we add an ES. So for example, dress becomes dresses, watch becomes watches, wash becomes washes, and fix becomes fixes. It's also pretty common to add an es to the end of verbs that end in o, but there are so many exceptions to that, I wouldn't really call it a rule, but we'll look at examples where this is the case. So go becomes goes, Goes, and veto becomes vetoes, Vetoes. And the last one is interesting because the pronunciation also changes. Do becomes does, Does. And that's actually the perfect place to end because it relates to our next section, negative statements. So when you're conjugating for negative statements in the simple present, it's the same two categories, I, you, they, and we, and he, she, and it. But what's different is that you'll be using what's known as an auxiliary verb. An auxiliary verb is a verb that isn't the focus of a sentence, but it affects the main verb of the sentence. So in this case, it's the auxiliary verb do or does. If you're conjugating for I, you, they, and we, it's the verb do and not, which can be turned into the contraction of don't, which, by the way, you'll usually say don't instead of do not. Do not is kind of overly formal, so you'll only really use it when you're trying to be fancy or you're trying to emphasize something, but in general, it's just don't. So you start with your subject, and then you say don't, and then you add your verb. So let's use the word play as an example. I don't play basketball. You don't play basketball very well. They don't play anymore. We don't play games together. And now I'll give you a chance to practice using the verb speak. And remember, you're conjugating it as a negative statement. I, you, Rebecca and Carla, Jason, Sarah, and I hope you did well because now we're moving on. So he, she, and it. When you conjugate this, it's the same thing. You start with your subject and then you add your auxiliary verb, which in this case is does not or doesn't, and then you add your other verb. And I want you to take note of the fact that does is already conjugated. There's already an S at the end of does, or an ES. So that means that your verb doesn't also need to be conjugated. You can just put the basic form of the verb. So let's look at an example of this. Work. It becomes he doesn't work. Not he doesn't works. That's incorrect. Just he doesn't work. She doesn't work. It doesn't work. And now I'll give you a chance using the verb speak. Clark, Janet, my dog. All right, good. Now we're going to move on to questions. Again, when you're using a question, you will use an auxiliary verb, but with questions, the ordering of your words is going to change. So you start with your auxiliary verb, do or does, then you add your subject, then you add your verb, and you can end the question there or you can add more information. So for I, you, they, and we, it's paired with do. So do, subject, verb, etc. Let's start with the verb need. Do I need a notebook? Do you need a pencil? Do they need help? Do we need to leave? And now you practice using the verb dance. I, now, you, well, Stacy and Alex, ballet, my sister and I, together. Okay, now moving on to he, she, and it. These subjects are paired with does. So does, subject, verb, etc. We'll use the verb go. Does he go to my school? Does she go there often? Does it go in the washing machine? And now you practice with the verb move. Kevin, Nancy, the ride. Alright, so that concludes the general rules. Now we're going to talk about exceptions, beginning with the verb to be. So this is a very, very important one because this is one of the most common verbs, especially in the simple present tense. So everything else has been split into 2 categories so far, but to be is split into 3. I, you, they, and we, and he, she, and it. So I is conjugated with am, I am. You, they, and we is conjugated with are, you are, they are, and we are. And he, she, and it is conjugated with is. He is, she is, and it is. And to be is extra unique because all of its conjugations can be turned into contractions. So I am turns into I'm, you are turns into your, they are turns into their, we are turns into we're, he is turns into he's, she is turns into she's, and it is turns into its. Now let's talk about negative statements. So the categories again are I, you, they, and we, and he, she, and it. And in order to turn these statements negative, all you do is add not at the end. So I am not. You are not. They are not. We are not. He is not. She is not. And it is not. And again, to be is unique because you can turn it into contractions. So not only can you combine the subject with the verb to be, you can also combine the verb to be with the word not. So you could either say I'm not, or you could say I amn't. You could say you're not, or you could say you aren't. You could say they're not, or you could say they aren't. You could say we're not, or you could say we aren't. You could say he's not, or you could say he isn't. You could say she's not, or you could say she isn't, and you can say it's not, or you could say it isn't. And I do want you to notice that I've highlighted I amn't because that is technically a word, but it's a very, very, very old word, and most people don't say it anymore. So if you use this word, people might think you're kind of weird, but it's technically correct. Okay, and now we're going to talk about how to ask questions using the verb to be. So all you have to do is change the order. You start with the verb to be, and then you add your subject, and you can end it there, or you can add more information. So, am I, or am I, whatever. Are you, are they, are we, or are you tall, are they annoying, are we cool? Is he, is she, is it, or is he your brother? Is she the teacher? Is it useful? And now let's talk about can. So can is really, really easy because everything is just can. There is no categories. It's just I can, you can, they can, we can, he can, she can, and it can. And if you wanted to make a negative can statement, you can use the contractions can't or cannot. Or you could say can not. And again, there is no categories, so any of the subjects can go with any of these forms of can't. So I can't, you can't, they can't, we can't, he can't, she can't, I cannot, you cannot, they cannot, we cannot, he cannot, she cannot, it cannot, and you get the point. And if you want to ask a question using can, you start with can, and then you add your subject, and you can end it there, or you can add a verb and more information. So, can I, can you, can they, you get the point. Or, can I sing? Can you leave? Can they be quiet? Can we go? Can he rap? Can she sing? So I hope all all of that has made sense. If you have any questions, you can message me. So bye. See you next week.